Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 84th episode of the Writ Podcast. There's an election call in Prince Edward Island. It wasn't supposed to happen before October, but instead, Islanders will be going to the polls on April 3rd. And there's a number of things to keep an eye on during this election. So to help me explain what's happening on this campaign trail, I'm joined today by Teresa Wright, freelance political reporter, former national reporter for Global News and Canadian Press, and Stuart Neatby, political reporter in PEI for the Saltwire Network. Stu and Teresa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be here.
So, yeah, I said this election was supposed to happen in October, and instead it's going to happen in April. Stu, maybe you can kick us off. Why is this election happening now?
I mean, essentially, we all have our theories. The response, I think, that from the Premier is because normally there's elections in the spring in PEI every 4 years. But essentially, I mean, we just finished up the Canada Games, and I guess Dennis King, like most other premiers, has secured a large chunk of federal health funding over the next 10 years. I think the chunk for PEI is $288 million of new money, which is substantial here for a small province. So Dennis King is pretty strong in the polls. It's to his advantage to go now as opposed to waiting until the fall.
Teresa, what's your...
Even though we promised.
Yeah, well, that's it. But Teresa, what's your take on it, and why was October more of a risk than April?
I'm not sure that it was necessarily more of a risk. I think that's part of the reason why people were kind of surprised that it came early, because up until recently, Dennis King has said that he would honor PEI's fixed election date. There was really no compelling reason for him to go early, except that I think they had volunteers already ready to go from the Canada Games. I mean, 6 months, anything can happen in 6 months. We know this. I really don't think that anything significant may have happened, but as Stu said, they've got all this new money to play with. And also, I think there's something to be said for the whole reason that PEI brought fixed election dates in was because the government of the day, the Robert Giz Liberal government, they wanted to allow for there to be more transparency in the finances of the province. Because the election prior to that, there had been a budget come in, and then when they went to the polls, the Liberals got into power, and all of a sudden the money wasn't exactly as it had been portrayed. So they wanted there to be audited financial statements from the previous year and a budget that had been presented so that people could see this is where things are with the province's money. And that's one of the things that we don't get as a result of them going early this time. We don't really know. And I think that's really important, especially in this particular case, because if you look across the country, every single provincial budget and the federal budget, there's never been a time where there's been so much fluctuation in terms of what provinces were expecting to get in revenues and what they're actually taking in because of the huge jumps in inflation. So there's never been a time when we're more in the dark about where the province's finances are. So I think that's really, again, it definitely works to Dennis King's advantage because they have a better idea of how much money they have to work with and how much revenue they have, whereas the other parties just don't have that benefit.
Stu, was there a possibility that this was going to be like a bad news budget and they just wanted to get ahead of it?
Well, it's possible. Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, there's been this sort of phenomenon that's been going on in Prince Edward Island that I don't think has quite been the case in most other provinces, where every time this sort of public accounts come out, there's oh my goodness, it's a surprise giant surplus of like tens of millions of dollars, and that's sort of held up as like this sort of our economy is booming, we're doing great, we're punching above our weight, we're the smallest province, but here we are. And we're going into, I guess, a period of perhaps economic uncertainty. So, it's a pretty good explanation. Thinking that might not hold up this year of sort of a yet another surprise surplus. Again, there's been a lot of heavy spending programs that have come out. Probably the most notable recently from the Dennis King government was spending $50 million on kind of an inflation relief package that took effect in January, where most household in the province got over $200, just a kind of a check from government sort of thing. So I mean that's a $50 million hole in the budget. We don't quite know if what kind of consequence that's going to have by year end. So that could be a reason, sure.
I did hear from King that there might be a federal election in the fall, which I'm curious to know who he's speaking to here in Ottawa, because we're not really expecting an election in the fall, but who knows? Maybe it could happen. Okay. So there was a poll that came out this week. It was very nicely timed by Narrative Research, who is really the only polling firm that puts out numbers for PEI, and had a huge lead for the PCs, pretty much what it was in the fall, with the party at 49%. Huge gap. The Greens were second in the, I think it was 21 or around there, and the Liberals were at 19. That's a big lead, especially when we're looking at where the PCs were in 2019, where they just squeaked out a minority government. Teresa, for people who aren't following PEI politics, why has King been able to build up this sizable lead in the polls and be as popular as he seems to be?
Well, I think once a government is in power, then in PEI they tend to just kind of do very well in polls that are done between elections, especially if there's been a change in government. Islanders just tend to kind of, if they have a change, they kind of stick with it, at least for a decade, and then maybe 10 years later they'll start looking at changing their minds about things. I think that Dennis King also has this really sort of folksy quality. He's able to sort of speak to people on their level. He used to be, a storyteller, performer. He really plays that up a lot in any time he appears in public. And of course, he has been in public quite a lot over the last couple of years because of COVID-19. And I think that also helped to help him build that support as well, because PEI did very, very well in the early days of the pandemic in terms of keeping the number of cases and the number of deaths very low. That obviously started to shift over the last year, but that came when people stopped really wanting to pay attention to it anymore. So I think he sort of benefited from some things that you wouldn't think that he would benefit from, in terms of what you would think COVID would not be a good thing. But there was sort of this whole, we're all in this together. He really definitely, I think, got a lot from that. And then since then, there really hasn't been a very strong opposition. And honestly, I think that's a huge part of this as well.
Stu, is this campaign, is it about just that kind of thing, leadership, who people trust versus the other ones? Or is this an issue-based campaign? I'm generally someone who feels leadership is what decides almost every election, but what do you think is at play here?
Well, yeah, so far, I guess the opposition is trying to make it an issue-based campaign, and King is trying to make it a who do you trust leadership campaign. So far, healthcare is sort of the early leader as the big issue of the campaign. For the past 3-4 days, pretty much all the parties have just been doing announcement after announcement related to healthcare, and for good reason. This is, we have I think the latest numbers are 28,000 people on the patient registry, which rough math is about 1/6 of the population. So it's family doctors, it's a huge issue here. It gums up the rest of the system. People go to emergency rooms for sort of primary care elements, and that creates its own problems. And nobody's really seeing a whole lot of improvements. That is the issue. But the thing is for 4 years, I feel like I've been covering the opposition sort of taking shots at Dennis King's record on healthcare. Ambulatory care, ambulance wait times have gone up. Emergency room wait times have gone up hugely. It's double the number of people on the patient registry without a family doctor as it was 4 years ago. But in a way, I don't think none of that has really stuck to King during his tenure leading the province. And I think it's partly the explanation for that is it's partly, I think, a little bit of what Teresa was talking about. Like, there is a tendency in PEI to have sort of two-term governments to sort of re-elect. But King has really been the crisis guy. He had COVID. He sort of was extremely popular in the early tenure of COVID. Partly that was due to the leadership of Heather Morrison with the local chief public health office. But so after that, then you have kind of the potato crisis, the U.S. border disruption. He became very popular, I think, for his response there. There's not always a lot of regional alienation in PEI, but during that event, people really felt that Ottawa had not been responsive to local industry and farming concerns. There's been climate storms, Fiona, and then before that, Dorian in 2019. There's been the inflation crisis. I think the thing about those two crises, which sort of cropped up in the last year, is the response to them was not as strong. You saw a bit of a dip down in opinion polling on King. He was still the most popular premier in the region, but you started to see a little bit like 5% increments of sort of a decrease in voter satisfaction. But yeah, I mean, essentially, it sort of seemed that Dennis King is sort of the rubber band man. Like he's always sort of stayed at a very high kind of political popularity, and I think it's this crisis, pattern in his tenure that really explains it.
Well, if it was about his ability to handle these crises, and if PEI has this tendency of re-electing governments, then the onus is really on the opposition to be terrific to try to defeat that kind of government, right? Because when it is a one-term government, and if the government's not completely failing, then the opposition has to be really good. So let's talk about the opposition, because the 2019 campaign got a lot of attention in the rest of the country because the Greens had this surge in the polls. There were some polls at the end of the campaign that suggested they might actually be able to win it. In the end, they finished second, which is still something that's not happened anywhere else. Teresa, how does the Green campaign look this time?
Well, I think that they are definitely starting off in a very different situation than in the last campaign. They aren't as popular, and Islanders have had this chance to see what they would do in opposition for the last, just under 4 years. And as much as I actually sometimes am surprised at how little that the public doesn't really, that they haven't been able to resonate, because they've actually been very effective at getting legislation passed, at really kind of hammering away at issues that are really important to a lot of Islanders, and actually kind of moving the needle. In terms of, I've watched PEI governments for a long time, and I've never seen an opposition that is as organized, as that understand the legislation, understand the issues, understand policy, to the extent that these folks do. But it just doesn't resonate with the people on the ground. And I think part of that is reflective of the fact that they just don't have a grassroots position in PEI in terms of the party's place, and they haven't really done a lot to build that. They've done a lot to work on policy. They spend a lot of focus and time on the legislature, but Islanders don't, and that's the thing, is that they care about who is going to help fix their potholes. Should that be their MLA? Absolutely not, but that's the person that they're going to call. Who is going to help their brother get a job? Who is going to help them get their EI figured out? Again, all of these things should not be the role of an MLA, but this is kind of the role that an MLA plays in PEI. And I don't know that they've really kind of have been able to really kind of get into that as much, and tap into that community sort of aspect, that grassroots aspect. And I think that's where you're seeing now that they don't have the ground game to be able to have the fight that they need to in this election.
Stu, what's your view of the Greens? And also, when you're going into a campaign like 2019, probably a bit harder to get very highly qualified people to run when there's not much of an expectation of winning. But this time, there might be a bit more of a chance that if you run for a Green nomination, you might actually become an MLA. Is the team any different this time, or how does it look for the Greens compared to 2019?
The biggest difference I found in the team is that there's two sort of incumbent MLAs out of their total caucus of 8. One, Hannah Bell, decided not to reoffer, and Hannah was the second Green actually elected pre-2019. I think it was a by-election, and it's still a little strange, a little mysterious as to why she decided not to reoffer. I mean, she said it was for personal reasons, but maybe that's not what's happening. I honestly have not been able to, verify what the real situation was. And the second is another incumbent MLA named Ola Hammerland, who's sort of a downtown Charlottetown kind of MLA. And he he sort of had a nomination challenge. He was the only incumbent MLA to have a nomination challenge. A land use planner named Janice Harper basically, took his candidacy out from under him. And he later told the CBC that he had been asked by the party not to run. So it suggests that there's some internal issues going on in the Greens. I don't have a good handle on exactly what they are and why they are, but sort of deducing from those two things. I guess the second thing, part of the reason I think the Greens haven't really maintained Peter Bevan Baker, the leader, was the most popular political figure going into the 2019 election. But I think his brand got completely swiped by Dennis King. Like, his brand was essentially about, sort of reaching across the aisle, not being overly partisan, sort of being the opposition of what the Liberals had been, very partisan, very sort of, a 3-term incumbent kind of government. And the Greens were initially viewed as sort of a refreshing alternative to that. Now, Dennis King, when he ran in 2019, ran on collaboration. The idea was to sort of take ideas from across the floor, and he introduced some minor parliamentary reforms, like standing committees had sort of equal representation. And I think part of that is he sort of took a lot of the things that people were attracted to Peter Bevan Baker over. And, that and the crises, I think that sort of explains, I think, a little bit why the Greens haven't quite been able to regain their steam. And Teresa is absolutely right. I don't think they don't have district associations in every district, just like sort of basic grassroots stuff. So they've prioritized the policy work, which was very good. They passed probably an enviable amount of legislation as an opposition party, but I don't think they really focused as much on the grassroots stuff.
I also think that the Liberals are a really big factor in this as well, because unlike other opposition parties and PEI in the past, the Greens have had to contend with both the Liberals and the Conservatives kind of coming after them and criticizing them in public and kind of like in the sort of like the coffee shops and, in sort of small group settings and so on. And so there's this very much this sort of whisper campaign of that, the Greens are really ineffective. Like, how did they ever get elected? And you see that even in terms of what the Liberal strategy has been in this election, because right now the Liberals, they're the third party, and the leader is running against Peter Bevan Baker, which is generally speaking something that leaders don't do. They don't run against each other. She doesn't even live in that riding. So she's parachuting herself into that riding to run against him. So she has the Liberal Party has declared they know they're not going to win this election. So they're trying to win second place, and they're trying to just get the Greens out of the way, because the Greens are basically eating their lunch when it comes to votes. So that's where I think the Greens are really having this additional struggle, that it's almost like the Conservatives and Liberals aren't even really focused so much on each other. They're all focused on the Greens and discrediting the Greens and trying to get the Greens out of the picture, because it's really been a very disruptive factor in terms of the push and pull of the history of politics in PEI, because there absolutely is this sort of attitude that in PEI politics that it's my turn or it's your turn, and we take turns, and it's just been come to be accepted, and people kind of, they don't always like it, but they get used to it. And the Greens have just completely blown that whole idea up, and so I think they've kind of come to the conclusion that we just need to get rid of the Greens, and then we can go back to the way things were before, and we all know what to expect with that. So I think that's a really big factor here too.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, because only the Liberals and the Conservatives have ever governed, and before Peter Bevan Baker won a seat, the NDP had only ever won one seat ever. So it was very much like a blue versus red. And I was trying to find it today, if in PEI there had ever been a case of party leaders running against each other in a riding or a district. And at least for leaders who had representation in the House, I couldn't find one going back to at least the late 19th century. So it is a very strange thing to go up against the leader, particularly, as you said, when you don't live in the riding. So it is a very clear signal that the Liberals are gunning for second. And there's often the saying in politics that if you run for opposition rather than for prime minister or premier, that's what you'll end up winning. I don't know if it's the case, though, if you're running for second, if you win second, you finish third. Stu, what do you make of the Liberals and this campaign? Because it is a very, it does seem like they're primarily running against the opposition, not the government.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment for sure. I think, the Liberals took a very long time to get a new leader. I mean, Sharon Cameron was kind of like a senior civil servant, in the previous Liberal government. And it had sort of seemed like the party just couldn't really find candidates, anybody who wanted to run. But I think also there was sort of just they lost one MLA, Robert Mitchell. He sort of retired. I can't remember exactly. It was maybe about less than a year after the election. And then Heath MacDonald steps down to run federally for the Liberals and wins Wayne Easter's seat in Malpeque. And so there was a bit of an attrition, and it just sort of seemed like for a long time the Liberals just were not getting off the mat. And so Sharon comes along and appears to be sort of giving it a proper run. And I think the reason she chose 17 is because nobody would have known who Sharon Cameron is otherwise. Like, it got a lot of attention. Like, people suddenly paid attention to the Liberals, which they hadn't really been for quite a while. And again, like, I've had academics here tell me that, like, the Liberals used to be the natural governing party of PEI. Like, again, like, whether you believe it or not, I mean, like, people have thought that before. So it was an extraordinary thing for them to sort of be bumped down from, like, governing to, distant third place. So it's a bit of a gambit. It's a bit of a wily move on the part of Sharon Cameron, but if she wins it, it might work. Yeah, I mean, it might look like they're due for a comeback in another 4 years, so we'll see.
But I think that also just kind of speaks, right, but I think it speaks to why Dennis King is also just not really seeming like he's having much of an opposition right now, because the two other parties are duking it out for second place, and so no one is holding the government to account. No one is trying to run against Dennis King, and so he just gets to, like, walk into first place while everyone is in the back fighting, and to me, it was a surprising move and I think just a bad one for democracy in PEI, because Islanders should be given viable options for a government and somebody who else just thinks that they want to and could form government. And it's too bad when you've got parties who are just trying to play a long game, and that's essentially what the Liberals are doing. They know they're not going to win this election, so they're just playing a longer game and saying, okay, well, at least if we can get in opposition, that will be better, and then we'll build from there. And so in the meantime, we just have to, we're just stuck with the same government now, and so there's almost no point in having an election.
Well, it does seem like an election where everybody is agreed what the outcome will be, even the other parties, which is just a bizarre place to start. So I guess we'll find out. It'll be interesting to see as well. I assume there's going to be a leaders debate. I'm not sure if it's scheduled yet, but who is actually going to get most of the barbs thrown at them? Is it going to be Dennis King or Peter Bevan Baker? So that'll be an interesting dynamic. I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the NDP. I know that the NDP does not have a strong history in PEI over the last few elections. They've had a rough go of it. There was a poll, the narrative poll that came out had some decent numbers for the New Democrats out in Prince County, where they have Herb Dickinson, who is the only ever New Democrat to ever get elected in PEI. And, in my own seat estimates that I do on the Writ, I did give that seat, Leary Inverness, to Dickinson. I'm not sure, though, whether I even believe those numbers myself. So both of you, since you're actually there on the island, and I'm just looking at cold, hard numbers, Stu, maybe you can go first. Is that just an artifact in numbers that's not likely? Does the NDP actually have a chance of winning that seat?
Well, Herb came the closest last time. I think he was like within 200 votes or something. I don't know. Anything's possible, but yeah, Herb would be the one who probably has the best shot. Maybe their leader, Michelle Neal, is running in Charlottetown Brighton, but she's running against Rob Lance, who's a former leader of the Progressive Conservatives. And she's that's the district of that Green candidate I was talking about, Ole, who is now, Janice Harper. So it'd be a tough go there. That would be the best shot. I don't know. I mean, typically West Prince, like the western end of the island, has been thought of as sort of a liberal stronghold. And Henderson is a very well-known incumbent, the liberal incumbent there. He's a former health minister. So I don't know. It is possible. I find it a bit of a long shot.
Teresa, am I just crazy?
I think, I think you're right to say that if there is going to be any NDP breakthroughs, that would be the one. But as Stu says, Robbie Henderson has had that seat and now for a number of years, and even as a member of the third party, I think he's been very vocal and always has been, even when he was part of the government, even when as a backbencher. I personally think that the government or the former premier put him into cabinet because he was sometimes a thorn in the side of his own government, because he was willing to kind of speak out if it meant that he was sticking up for his constituents. And so that's where I say that I can't see him not winning his seat if he's really going to give it a strong go. But you know, you never know what could happen, especially given that, you know, again, the Liberals are just, they're not really where they usually are. They don't have the ground game that they usually do because they don't have the people that are motivated to come out and volunteer. And you see that in the fact that they don't even have all their candidates nominated yet. And the types of candidates that they're getting are not the kinds that you would normally see from a party that had been in power for so long. So you know, anything's possible.
Yeah, I guess just giving a plug for that, you know, like we're probably handing a lot of advantage to the Tories largely because polling, but I think the X factor in this is that, you know, all the conditions in healthcare that you saw in Nova Scotia in the last election, they're here too. I mean, like the wait times, like the ambulance wait times, the rural struggles. I mean, like, again, looking at West Prince again, that Western Hospital, it's in Alberton, not too far from Rob Henderson's district, and it's closed every weekend. I mean, it's essentially closed. It only runs sort of I think it's maybe 7 to 3. You know, so the overnight portion has been closed since the summer. So like rural healthcare is it's a real concern for people. You know, it could be life or death. Who knows? So there are these sort of like other X elements that could spiral out of control over the course of a political campaign. Cost of living is still extremely high in Prince Edward Island. I think we still have the highest inflation. I could be off on that. So yeah, I mean, anything could happen. Even though, yes, the polling does indicate that the advantages are strongly in favor of the Blue team.
Yeah, and the Liberals were favored to win in Nova Scotia before that campaign, right? Tim Houston was able to make it about healthcare and able to win. Teresa, go ahead.
That's what I was going to say, that like, you know, it feels very much like it could be potentially like a Nova Scotia situation if healthcare and if the issues really start to dominate. And on that note, I do think that there's a potential for that to happen, because I've noticed that in the couple of days that since the campaign has started, you know, Dennis King has sounded like very almost tone deaf to a lot of the concerns that have been coming forward, and a lot of he's running on his record. He says anybody, and he's using a lot of really bold rhetoric, saying that never in the history of the province has there ever been, you know, have we ever payments to islanders ever been this high, and he's making and things that are not necessarily measurable. Meanwhile, Islanders are really struggling, like financially, they're struggling to get healthcare. They can't get in to see their doctor, and we have the highest proportion of seniors of any other province in the country. So having, you know, poor access to healthcare is a really big problem. And so I think, and you know, the way that he's kind of going about, you know, his message, it could very much backfire on him, because it doesn't seem as though he's admitting the problems. He seems as though he's very confident on his record, and he's confident that the things that the ideas he's presenting could, you know, work, even though some of the things, like for example bringing a medical school to PEI, that's been a lot of, you know, people who know, including the experts at Health PEI and others, are saying that, you know, opening a medical school is not going to solve the problems that Dennis King is trying to say that it will. Number one, it won't even have any graduates till 2030, and number two, we don't have the staff to be able to allow for this to happen. So, and this is something that he's using as an example of, how we're going to fix everything. So that's where I'm wondering about, you know, whether his own messaging may end up being his own downfall.
And
one quick thing on,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess I was just sort of just on pure polling, I guess. The one thing I can sort of put in the Green camp is that they have managed to establish a floor, like consistently in their polling. They've never, I think the lowest they've been in is 18%, but generally they've sort of stayed at the 20 to 25% level, and that includes in most of the by-elections that have happened here in the last 4 years. So I mean, they do have that, like, like people looking at this sort of place as a bit of an experiment for the Greens. It doesn't look to me like they'll fade away, I guess, completely with this election. I think they'll still maintain a pretty significant presence.
Well, I just wanted to finish on this for an audience that would be outside of PEI primarily. The Liberals, the federal Liberals, hold all 4 seats right now, and they won them pretty handily last time. But how much of a link is there between the federal parties and the provincial parties? Particularly when they're thinking about the PCs and the federal Conservatives, that there is a bit of a gulf there in terms of their policies and where they are on the spectrum, the political spectrum. Teresa, maybe you can just kick us off with that. Just if you're a political operative in Ottawa, is there anything that they're going to be watching in the results?
I think, in terms of the differences between the PEI progressive Conservatives and the federal Conservatives, I think the gulf couldn't be wider. I think that's much closer between the PCs here and the Liberals. And you see that. Denny King gets along very well with Justin Trudeau and has worked very collaboratively with him. And Trudeau has used that to his advantage in many cases as well, in terms of trying to negotiate different the childcare deal and now the health accord. But I think in terms of what would work better for the federal government, I mean, like I said, all of the political parties in PEI, they're very, very similar. They're almost, the only thing that separates them in terms of their actual policies and their ideology is the name alone. I mean, if you actually look at what they stand for and all of the different policy decisions that they make or promise, they're almost identical. I was looking at all the promises, just trying to remind myself, and they're all promising the same thing. So there's not a huge difference. So I think it would be interesting to actually try to pin some of the Conservative candidates on what they think about Pierre Poilievre and and his policies and some of the directions he's been trying to take, because I was just speaking kind of informally with a couple of the candidates. Some of them are incumbent candidates at the Writ drop the other night, and I would say that privately they're not necessarily on the same page as Pierre Poilievre. I'm not sure what they would say publicly, but I don't know that there's a lot of collaboration there.
Yes, Stu?
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that among the progressive Conservatives here, there's a lot of alignment with Pierre Poilievre. I could be wrong, but I'm. Yeah. It's a bit different with the Liberals. Like, there seems to be a bit more symmetry with the federal party with the provincial Liberals, and when it comes to the Greens, it's a bit of more of a fraught relationship, I find, between the provincial Greens and the federal Greens. We had a candidate, Anna Keenan ran for the leadership of the Greens, and I could, only one of the provincial MLAs wanted to actually endorse her. I guess that's pretty much it. I mean, Teresa, I think is absolutely correct. I would even say the previous Liberal government is probably more fiscally conservative than the current King Tories. I've had Liberal MLAs tell me that, that they thought that they were kind of more of a conservative government. But I just don't think those things are really matter here in the same way. Like, I don't think you're going to have, a block of voters who are, no deficit hawks kind of voters. Like, I just don't think that's what sort of motivates people.
So neither of you are expecting to see Pierre Poilievre on the campaign trail with Dennis King, or I could see Jagmeet Singh taking a run. He sometimes likes to visit in the provincial campaigns, but I'm not sure if that will help the NDP all that much. They do need a bit of a boost for sure. So this campaign is just getting started. It was telegraphed for a while, so it didn't come as too much of a surprise it was coming as soon as it did. But April 3rd will be voting day. Hopefully we'll get another chance to chat again, because I still think this is an interesting campaign. And thanks so much for both of you to give me your time today and let everybody know what's happening on the island.
Oh, well.
Yeah, thanks for taking the interest, really.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.